Hi, good afternoon. Good to be with you all here today. We're going to continue to let some of the attendees roll in. My name is Abby Ape, the director of the Brickell Homeowners Association. I'm here with our esteemed guest and panelists, which I will introduce to you very shortly. I'm just going to let some people continue to come in. But thank you for joining us here today. I see some very familiar faces in the audience. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give it about a minute or so to get started as everyone continues to trickle in. Just so you know, this is being broadcasted live on YouTube, so you can see it at a later date, share with your neighbors, board members, anybody who's interested in learning more about what happened in Acapulco. We'll be glad to redistribute this webinar at a later time as well. For the sake of time, we'll get started and we'll let people trickle in as they choose to. But as I mentioned, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Abby Ape. I'm the managing director of the Brickell Homeowners Association. I'm here with our esteemed guest. And I think before we begin diving into the webinar, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. If, Diana, you would like to kick us off?
Hi, how are you? My name is Diana Cato. I'm the Senior Business Management Development for Claremont Property CO, General Contractor for Emergency Services.
And we also have here Falcon. Would you like to go ahead and share?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Riddle with the Falcon Group. We're full service engineering firm and have dealt with a lot of hurricane damage and hurricane preparedness.
And last but not least, Mr. Norcross.
Hi, everybody, and it's good to be with you today. I'm Brian Norcross, Fox Weather hurricane specialist, and of course, I've been around South Florida talking about hurricanes for a long, long time.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for taking the time today to join us. We're so honored that you decided to join in this very important webinar discussion. Before we begin, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping issues. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be later shared through different distribution channels, email, social media. Also, it is being broadcasted live on YouTube, so you're able to share this with your audience whenever you see fit. Just so you know, the chat box is open and so is the question and answers box. So if you have any questions as we're continuing the discussion, have anything you would like to say, feel free to drop that in the Q&A session. We'll be happy to answer those as time allows. We want your active participation, so please, we want to hear from you. Let us know what it is that you are interested in or if you need further clarification. So now that we're going to get started, we just wanted to bring together this very important webinar, Lessons and Reflections from the Acapulco Hurricane Tragedy. We saw this go from a tropical storm that rapidly intensified into a hurricane, and the aftermath, which really was shocking to me. Diana shared this on her LinkedIn. She shared the catastrophic photos that came from the condominiums and the communities in Acapulco. And so that got us thinking, can this happen here in Miami? What happens when we get hit with a Hurricane 4 category? And what does that mean for the condo community? And you all, as representatives of your condo community, you kind of have this responsibility of staying informed and knowing what could potentially happen. So we have everyone here at the table who's going to educate us a little bit on what happened. And we're going to go ahead and get started with Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross, can you explain to us how this tropical storm went undetected, turned into a hurricane, and could this happen here in Miami? You can.
Yeah, Abby, this was a shocking event. I haven't seen in my time anything, and I've been around a long time, anything quite like this, where such an incredible storm hit with extremely short amount of warning. It wasn't that there was no warning, but it was an extremely short amount of warning, like nothing I've seen. We've had a few bad forecasts. Hurricane Dorian was one in the Caribbean. If you remember, Dorian was the one that hit northeastern Bahamas so badly, so incredibly in was it 2019? But and the way it hit the Virgin Islands as it came out of the Caribbean was a surprise. But it wasn't a Category 5 hurricane coming ashore as a surprise. So this was really something very, very different. All right, let's take a look at what happened. Let me share here, and I'll get this going. Okay. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint here. So the question is, could it happen here? The answer is no, not exactly what happened in Acapulco, but yes, a significant event akin to what happened in Acapulco could very well happen in South Florida, and I'll explain the no and the yes. That's seems like a non-answer, I guess, when you look at that on the surface. Okay, so Hurricane Otis. What happened in Acapulco last October? Well, here are the preliminary stats. National Hurricane Center, after every hurricane or storm or anything, goes back after the fact, looks at all the data, tries to understand exactly what happened, and sometimes upgrades it, sometimes downgrades it, sometimes changes it a little bit because some data comes in after the fact. And remember, they're analyzing everything in real time. So things aren't exactly precise in real time, but they don't change a lot normally. So it was, as it came ashore, it was, landfall was estimated at 125 in the morning on the 25th of October with 165 mile an hour sustained winds, gusts over 200. Pressure at 923, that should say millibars, not miles per hour, 923 millibars. And here you see Acapulco over here on the satellite, and notice that the eye went just to the left. So that meant that the winds were coming around in a counterclockwise way, and the worst of the winds were coming on shore right in Acapulco. They could not have been more unlucky in exactly where that eye hit. Originally, the eye was forecast to come farther north, so the worst of it would have been up the coast, and the city would not have had this direct hit. So they were, I mean, it was a stunningly unlucky thing. And it was, as I said, a tremendous forecast failure, 27 and a half hours. So just over 24 hours. Remember, this thing hit it with 1:25 in the morning. And so the 10 p.m. advisory, so it hit on a Wednesday morning, the 10 p.m. advisory on Monday night, so nominally a day before, had a landfall forecast of 70 to 75 miles per hour, maybe a category 1. The landfall was forecast to be about 13 hours later than it actually happened. So not only did it come in incredibly stronger, it came in so much faster. Imagine a hurricane coming, 12, 13 hours before you expect it. That's another really difficult issue. It was supposed to come in during the day on Wednesday, wherever it hit the coast, ended up coming in the overnight hours. There was contradictory satellite evidence when it was offshore here of what was going on. And the computer forecast models that we rely on showed generally a fairly weak system, or even the American GFS system said it was going to stay offshore in that time when it was offshore. So the evidence that we had did not indicate this. Now, why was that? We'll talk about that in just a second. Now we're at 15 and a half hours before landfall. So now we're during the day of the day before it hit that night. So it hit just after midnight. This is in the afternoon hours of that day, 4 p.m. Now there's some indications that it's getting organized. So the National Hurricane Center forecast upped it to 90 to 100 miles per hour. But still, their landfall estimate was about 7 hours late. It was supposed to be in the morning, not in the overnight hours. There were some signs by that time that it could intensify, but the models and the model showed rapid intensification was possible, but the consensus of the information that was available was that it was not going to become super intense. Although the Hurricane Center was starting to go, what's going on here? Maybe there is something, but still, so that's why they went up to 90 to 100 miles per hour. Well, 9.5 hours. So now we are in the afternoon. I said afternoon. That other forecast was the morning of the day before it hit. This is the afternoon of the day before it hit. And a hurricane hunter went in there and found that the estimates from the satellites were way off. It was a much stronger storm, and as they were flying through it, right before their eyes, it was intensifying rapidly. So the Hurricane Center that afternoon at 4 p.m. Central Time increased the forecast to 140 to 150 miles per hour. Essentially, what happened, they still had about a 3-hour late landfall, but by that afternoon, so 4 p.m. here now, the afternoon before it hit, just after midnight, the forecast was quite good. The aircraft measurements far exceeded the satellite estimates. It happens sometimes, it even happens in the Atlantic, but not to this extent that I've ever seen. And indeed, it was a rapid intensification, 115 mile per hour intensification in 24 hours. So that set a record, that the conditions came together in some way for this storm to super intensify. Okay, so why was this not picked up? Well, essentially because there's a data void in that part of the Pacific. There's no radar in Acapulco, like we are so used to being able to see storms as they approach offshore in fine detail, because we have land-based radars all along the U.S. and in the Bahamas and in the Caribbean. We can see storms on radar. There is no Mexican radar for the Acapulco area. It's a generally dry climate there. There are no ocean buoys offshore. We have some ocean buoys spread around off the coast and out in the Atlantic, so that when a storm comes close, we have actually in situ measurements there that we can see if a storm is near a buoy. So we were dependent wholly on satellite estimates, which, as I said, were not accurate. The thing was kind of hiding from us under what we could see of the satellite. And there was very poor model analysis, but again, because the computer models rely on data. So if you don't have a lot of data going in, you don't get good answers going out. And this was extremely poor. The Pacific tends to be poorer than the Atlantic because there's nothing downstream, right? Downstream, things move from west to east. So in the Atlantic, we have the continental US and Central America, we have land to the west, and we have lots of measurements over the land. So we have a better understanding of what's coming along. In the Pacific, we have Hawaii out there, we have airplanes flying, we have satellites. We don't have the same kind of data density for storms coming in from the Pacific. So all that added up to poor model analysis. And we only had one hurricane hunter flight that afternoon before landfall because of the distance and the logistics and everything of getting a plane from Mississippi all the way over to the Mexican coast. And it wasn't forecast to be really bad. So they didn't put the attention on it that they would have. In the Atlantic, we have continuous aircraft coverage of storms approaching. So it's a little different. As I said, Atlantic storms are very, very well monitored as they get anywhere near land, or they're going to threaten land. And there were some special conditions there. The water off Acapulco was in the mid to upper 80s. It was a little warmer than normal. It's always super warm. That little kind of triangle of area off of Acapulco, you might have heard about, well, it's an El Nino year that makes the Pacific warmer. El Nino really didn't have anything to do with this. Right offshore, that's always a warm pocket of water. It was a little bit cooler in some parts of it, a little bit warmer than normal in other parts of it, but in any case, it was very warm. It's a small diameter storm. Small diameter storms are in the model, because the model works on a grid basis. More of the system can be hidden in the grid. So the fact that it was small made the forecasting without data, without really good data inside the storm, a bigger problem with the poor data. And it was relatively slow moving. There's a rule of hurricanes. So storms that move more slowly, the forecasts in general are not as good as storms that move quickly. Generally, what we're saying there is that the river of air that's driving them is not as well established if they're not moving along at a good clip. Not as well established means that the pattern is kind of mushy and it's not well defined. So the models, the computer forecasts, don't have as good an understanding of it. Then if you have a strong river of air, the models understand the river, the storm is embedded in it, and it moves along. So all those things kind of came together in a really unfortunate way. Also, and this probably has much to do with the incredible damage as anything, that this was an unprecedented event. In the record book in the Pacific going back to 1949, there's only one hurricane to make similar landfall in 1951 as a Category 1. Only one. So when you have a situation where you don't have any history, things aren't built in general and the systems aren't made to deal with it, including to some degree the forecasting systems, although we generally do the best we have with the information we have. Now, just compare that to Miami, which is a relative hurricane crossroads. In the first 7 decades of the 20th century, 7 hurricanes went over downtown Miami. That didn't count the other big hurricanes in Fort Lauderdale and everywhere else that hit South Florida. So look at all the storms here within 25 miles, only within 25 miles of downtown Miami in the record book, which does go back to 1851. We have some records in the Pacific before that, but they're not well organized. But we don't have any evidence of a big hurricane hitting Acapulco, where in Miami, multiple Category 3 to 5s have come even within 25 miles, let alone within 50 or 60 miles, which is what we normally look at. So in Acapulco, here's the view afterward, and this is the really scary view while we're talking today. The damage you see along the coast here and on up to the buildings is really not preventable. And this would happen in South Florida as well, would happen in Brickell, because if we had just the wrong hurricane just south of the city, driving a big storm surge from Biscayne Bay, which can be up to 15 feet, like over the land, 15 feet high. If that water comes in, that's going to damage everything at the ground. The difference is what's happened in these buildings here. That is preventable. We build in South Florida to keep this from happening. But remember, in Acapulco, they don't have any hurricane history. They don't build for hurricanes. They build for earthquakes. And when you build for earthquakes, you generally use light building materials because you don't want to have a lot of heavy stuff bouncing around in the earthquake. So buildings that are light survive earthquakes better than buildings that are heavy. And the solution to hurricane damage is heavy. So you have to build, if you're going to build for hurricanes and earthquakes, we'll let David talk about this more, but it's a different thing and it costs more money to some degree, but they don't do it there. And they haven't done it, and they haven't done it because they haven't had hurricanes. So this is what got them, really, is that they built for earthquakes, not for hurricanes. And they had this hellacious hurricane come along and kind of just wipe out all the light materials, windows, doors, and whatnot in these buildings. So what would a similar storm look like in South Florida? Well, we don't have to imagine too hard, because remember these stats here. Again, I have miles per hour down there. I don't know, I lost my mind there. So this is 923 millibars over 200 mile an hour gusts, 165 mile an hour storm. Well, in 1992, we had Hurricane Andrew that obviously didn't hit downtown in a big way, although there was a lot of damage on Brickell. In Hurricane Andrew, if it hadn't been so hellacious in South Dade, we would remember that as a Brickell event when furniture was flying out of one unit and into another unit, especially corner units were extremely vulnerable and along Brickell Avenue and in the downtown area. But look at the comparison here. Of course, that was 5 a.m. on August 24th. Sustained wind, 165 miles per hour, gusting over 200 miles per hour, which by the way, over 200 gusts is a top-end hurricane, a top-end tornado. That's an EF5 tornado. So the damage we're seeing is tornado, high-end tornado damage. Pressure on that one was 922 millibars, almost exactly the same. Now, there were differences. Otis was moving only about 10 miles an hour, so they got the strong winds actually longer, but it was weakening at landfall. So as it went ashore, it was getting weaker. Where Andrew was moving over 20 miles an hour, and it was intensifying at landfall, and that's why the damage from Andrew extended so far inland, all the way through Kendall, all the way to the Everglades. So they were somewhat different, but they were both small and similar kinds of ferocious hurricanes. The Hurricane Andrew, just think about if this were to happen again. You remember the timing on this, it hit overnight, Sunday night, Monday morning. That Wednesday before, it was weak and turning to the north. It was not a concern. I was on TV that night saying, we're watching it. We'll see. It's not a big concern at this point. We're just going to have to watch it. Then on Thursday, there was not even a closed circulation. So technically, it was not even a tropical storm on Thursday. And, it was coming in the direction of Florida. In theory, the models would be better now. But the thing is, when storms are disorganized or moving slowly, the forecasts are generally not good even today, or at least not as good as average. Finally was a tropical storm on Friday. I think in the modern world, we would have more concern. We would have concern by this time for the Florida coast. Became a Category 1 storm on Saturday. This was Saturday morning. Remember, it's going to hit the next night. So there are echoes here of what happened in Otis. The modern computer models, all the data we have today would, I don't think there's any doubt, make the forecast better. But a storm that is just developing, the forecast would likely not be conclusive. We would just have a better idea it was coming. And then Sunday night, Monday morning, we have a Category 5 landfall, obviously. So the Category 5 storms that have hit the U.S. have all been tropical storms a couple of days before. So it is normal for super intense small hurricanes to intensify rapidly. Not like Otis did. That was off the charts, but rapidly in a way that we have to ask ourselves, how ready would we be for a Hurricane Andrew type storm coming toward Miami, where on the Friday before it hits Sunday night, it's only a tropical storm? Would plans kick in and the things that we have to do to prepare? Hurricane Andrew and all of the Category 5 storms that have hit the U.S. There are 4 of them: Camille in 1969, Andrew, and Michael at Panama City, and then the 1935 Keys hurricane, which was sort of the granddaddy of them all, that hit the Middle Keys, were all small storms intensifying rapidly as they get right to the coast.
Wow.
Abby?
Wow, that's very insightful, and thank you for walking us through some of the things that happened and how it could and could not happen here. And so thank you for sharing that presentation. My question to you is there any predictions for this upcoming hurricane season yet, or any advice you would give as an expert?
Well, I think that Otis presented us with yet another lesson, like Michael did, like Andrew did, is that anybody whose hurricane plans take 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 days, they don't have a hurricane plan. You have to have a hurricane plan that takes 36 to 48 hours, because it can happen. And unfortunately, the worst of the worst can happen in that amount of time. So, hurricanes come in all these varieties. We have the Hurricane Irma kind of variety where we see it for 10 days and 7 days in advance, we realize there's a threat and so forth. And then we have the other variety that they really come together near the coast. As far as this hurricane season, the odds are that we had this quasi El Nino, kind of an odd El Nino last year, which tended to create a weather pattern that kept the storms offshore. That's not likely to be the case this year. It's likely to be something more of an average hurricane season. I think probably the forecasts are going to be in the 18 to 20 storm range, which is just a little above average if you look at the modern averages, not based on the averages of the past, because now we name more storms, so just storm names is not really the thing. But the oceans are warm. Whether they'll be spectacularly warm like last year remains to be seen. It usually takes until May or June until we have a better understanding of what the atmospheric conditions are going to be for the hurricane season.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely be keeping a close eye on that and seeing what predictions come in. Mr. Norcross, we'd love to have you back at a later time, just potentially to share some of those predictions with us if you're willing.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for that. If you just want to hang tight, if there's any questions for Mr. Norcross, feel free to send those in the Q&A option of our webinar. We are going to continue this discussion with David from the Falcon Group. Now, David, seeing those pictures as a condo homeowner, they're very impressionable, scary to think that something like that could happen here in Miami. So can you discuss the specific impacts that Hurricane Otis had on high-rise condominiums in Acapulco, as well as any potential structural vulnerabilities in the design flaw that contributed to the extensive damage? If you could share a little more about that.
Yes, and so I would call them more structural vulnerabilities than design flaws. They, according to all the accounts that I have read, the buildings were constructed pretty much in accordance with the codes. The issue is that the codes didn't anticipate quite to the event that they had there. So fortunately, it was designed to withstand earthquakes. So as Mr. Norcross was saying, the structure itself was built solid. It was intended to take a lot of stress and movement, but it wasn't intended to take the cladding and the equipment tied to the building, the signs tied to the building. Things were not there to they couldn't withstand what was hit. This is actually fairly similar to an event that I had very early in my career. In the early 90s, I was actually living in the Azores, Portugal, and this is an area, a little island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, subject almost all the time to high winds. You can kind of like here, somewhat of a tropical climate, but was always thought of as more prone for having the wind damage, and that's what they built for. Well, unfortunately, in 1980, they had a very massive earthquake. Again, much like Otis, unprecedented for the area, a lot of building damage. And so when I came there, codes take quite a while to change. And so it's going to be interesting to see how Acapulco and Mexico in general responds to it. But when in the early 90s, when I was there in the Azores, I could see the results of that. The buildings that I was designing at the time, we had to take into account now earthquakes. And so I suspect that that's going to be something. It'll be interesting to step back and see how quickly they modify those codes.
So you would say that compared to Mexico's building code to Miami, like where would we stand in terms of withstanding something of this magnitude?
So our codes, like Brian mentioned, Hurricane Andrew. So from a structural design standpoint, that's almost a milepost for structural engineers and for the code. Prior to that, the code wasn't as strong. It was arguably enforced willy-nilly. That's all changed, and we are continuously seeing code changes. For example, as a result, Brian mentioned Hurricane Michael. There's currently a move afoot to look at the codes for that area of Florida to see if we need to increase the wind loads that we designed to. And that's still a work in progress, but that's the question. So fortunately, we're in a better position. We have a lot more experience, for better or worse, going through these types of storms. But that doesn't mean that we still can't learn something from every storm.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like over the years as a Miamian, you kind of tend to relax around hurricane season. But I think one of the lessons we did learn from Otis is to not let your guard down and to always, always prepare. Taking us to our next question, given your expertise, what are some of the key lessons that we should take away from Hurricane Otis in terms of resilience, building resilience and preparedness for high-rise condos in an area like Miami, so close to the coast?
So I think there's three important things to take away from an event like this. Number one is just because you meet the code doesn't mean that there's not going to be damage. So even though we have very stringent codes, everything, there's lots of things that could happen. It's, again, Brian could talk about this. I've had a case where very, very localized winds within the hurricane. Far exceeded what the average. So the gusting, it was so great that caused more damage in that one very small localized area. But that others were okay. So that's important thing is to understand, and also the importance of this post-storm inspections to go out and make sure that everything truly has survived, that we think has survived, and to make sure that we get the necessary repairs going. The second, and again, referred to just very earlier, is we need to harden as much as we can now. The more that we harden our buildings and are ready to go without doing anything, the better we are. So, we're seeing this, of course, now the modern code, you have to have impact windows in new buildings. But for older structures, looking to go to the impact windows, making sure that our equipment's tied down, and even if it was older, but making sure that we meet that, and things that we can do right now to harden, because again, we may not have that time. And I think the other third lesson learned is to learn our lessons. We need to look at every storm and see what we did wrong, and see where we can improve things.
Right. Yeah, I think it goes to show just this past season, we had an unnamed storm that came in and really caused some damage with
Yes.
broken furniture flying, some flooding, broken windows at that. So I think it definitely, put our antennas up to be more aware and cautious when facing these unnamed storms and potentially future hurricanes, which, we're not exempt to. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Hi, Diana.
Hi,
So-
how are you?
Good, thank you. Just a little bit of backstory to our audience. I noticed that Diana posted the catastrophic photos that came from Acapulco online, and I reached out to her. I said, we have to do a webinar that's going to pull up some lessons that we can learn from this terrible tragedy. And so, Diana, thank you for bringing that to our attention. And, I have a couple questions for you. So to start off, looking beyond the immediate aftermath of the hurricane, what are the most significant long-term challenges faced in terms of recovery and rebuilding efforts? Are there any key strategies or approaches that can help communities recover more effectively when it comes to these catastrophic events?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the aftermath, right now they're lacking running water. So some residents still don't have running water. They lack supplies, food, wood, construction materials. Their deficiency sewer treatments, the sewer is still in trouble, and they have a lot of garbage and debris. Tons of garbage and debris remain in the streets. Not to say that 80% of local hotels are destroyed, 95% of business are damaged, and 220,000 homes are damaged. This all, is an economic setback, and then they're going to have housing issues, and then obviously restoring tourism is an issue. Key strategies that I can think about is, yes, absolutely. I think that we need to be proactive and plan. We have to be resilient to infrastructure development, community engagement, collaboration with government agencies, implementation of early warning signs. That's a huge one. Implementation of early warning signs, establishing emergency response plans, fostering community cohesion, and investing in sustainable infrastructure. I think all these will contribute to a more robust recovery process.
Right. No, absolutely. Like I mentioned, we tend to relax a little bit over hurricane season, but we cannot afford that, really, because there's so much at stake, our loss of life, of course, and all of the other things that come with the breaking down of a building, et cetera. So you're right. Can you discuss some of the long-term strategies or initiatives implemented by Claremont Property to enhance resilience and preparedness for high-rise condominiums in the aftermath of a hurricane?
Yes. So many business owners, they're very busy in the daily tasks, right? So they have little time to contemplate the potential impact of a disaster in the area. So what we do is we always try to engage everybody to really having an emergency plan in place beforehand, because this minimizes business disruption and obviously associated stress. We offer a priority response program to our clients. It's a comprehensive emergency response plan. It's starting with the understanding potentially facility risk, right? So we focus on creating a strategy to significantly reduce post-disaster business interruption. So we do a pre-loss inspection. We gather all the building details, and this allows us to immediately act following a disaster. So our team will arrive well acquainted with the property systems, securing all necessary equipment. So we advocate for property preparation plans, amazing building codes, establishing the business codes, investing in wind-resistant construction materials, and definitely regular structural assessment.
Right, definitely. And then another question that we have for you, Diana, is from the perspective of Claremont, reflecting back on this hurricane season and Hurricane Otis, what are some adaptations that your company took in terms of project management and disaster preparedness as a result?
Okay, well, as Brilliant mentioned, everybody was expecting a tropical storm, and in less than 24 hours, I mean, Otis became a Category 5. This definitely allowed minimum preparation time. So I think it's crucial to emphasize the significance of having a disaster preparation plans, your supplies, your equipment, your resilient infrastructure, and definitely engaging the community proactively. It's important to address the regional specific vulnerabilities like coastal areas to hurricanes and elevated storm surge. We have to keep that in mind. When evaluating a property and crafting an emergency plan, our approach extends beyond the property itself to encompass the entire region. We're emphasizing coordination with local authorities. So we encourage everybody to just be ready, just in case. Have your supplies, your generators, your debris removal plan, an easy system in place to protect your windows, doors, roofing, and other structures. Trim your trees and be ready.
Yeah, and I know that Claremont has a hurricane preparedness guide, correct?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Everyone hosts webinar, and like you mentioned, collaborating with local agencies. So every year we host a hurricane preparedness event, which we plan to host again this year. And we usually coordinate with the City of Miami Emergency Response Team, with the county, and then with people like Claremont and the Falcon Group, who are able to provide services to the people in the condominium world. So we know that this is something that we are going to continue to do. And so we're a little bit early this season, but there's never such a thing as being too early, because we know education and awareness are a big part in making sure that we ensure there's no loss of life in our communities when it comes to these things. Buildings can be rebuilt, but lives can never be replaced. So thank you for sharing those key takeaways with us, Diana. So we'll be sure to send that brochure to everybody post webinar. And so I'm going to head back to Mr. Norcross and ask a few questions. I'll ask these questions to all of you, but Mr. Norcross, we noticed that this was something that nobody was really prepared for, but has this changed the way that Acapulco is going to approach the next hurricane season? Meaning, did they put together things that are going to prevent that missing link from happening again? You mentioned there was a few missing links there in the Acapulco zone. Is there any changes that are going to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, or if it does happen again, at least they're better prepared?
Well, that's an open question. David was right that, this is a very difficult thing for them, because changing from building exclusively for earthquakes to building for hurricanes and earthquakes is a big thing. It's a big change. So, and they have to evaluate, okay, was this a freak event? Or was this, or do we need to respond to this? So, I mean, for example, in the middle of the United States, where there are tornadoes, we don't build tornado-proof homes. We just say, okay, we're going to put in a tornado shelter, a hole in the ground for people to go. And the home, if a strong tornado comes along, the home is destroyed. We don't try and make the home stand up to the tornadoes. So, they could make that choice that, no, we're just going to build for earthquakes, but in this zone, because we have two in this whole record going back to 1949. But we're going to have better plans in place. Maybe we have safe zones within the building for people, so that the people can be safe. I mean, they could make that choice because that's a cost benefit analysis, but it's a very, very difficult one. And in Mexico, where they don't have the resources that we had in Miami after Hurricane Andrew to make these choices to make homes more expensive. We actually made that that choice. And Abby, I think it's really important that since we're talking about Brickell Avenue, the Brickell zone in downtown Miami, this is a super hurricane prone place. You have buildings sticking up into the wind, right? And you can have we have a history of hurricanes here. A lot of hurricanes have hit downtown Miami, but not in a long time. We haven't had a really bad hurricane hit downtown Miami since 1950, when a Category 4 came from the south, Hurricane King, and hit. So it's a long, long time, but we've had a history of bad hurricanes. And I think that everybody that lives in the Brickell area needs to ask themselves, what would they do if a bad hurricane comes along? Because it will be an evacuation zone for any significant hurricane. And evacuation zone means you're supposed to leave, but it's not practical for everybody to leave. It's hard to get on the road. And, we saw terrible traffic in Hurricane Irma, and that wasn't even that much of a storm. And, unless you go early, you can't fly. So people are going to end up staying. So what does that mean? The problem with staying in a Brickell Avenue building, a modern one, it's not that the building's going to fall over, and there are safe places in the building. You can be in the hallway on the lower floor. People are going to survive just fine. And the car will be in the garage, and assuming the garage is elevated, the car is going to be fine. But if you can't drive outside because there is so much debris and glass and building materials and whatnot on the streets, that means you're stranded in the building with no power, no water, maybe no communications, and you can be stranded there for a good while. So really thinking this through is, in my mind, from a practical standpoint, the bigger challenge now, because we really have solved the building code problem. Not that, as David said, you're not going to have some damage in every building, but buildings are going to be safe to be in the building somewhere. Maybe not in your apartment on the corner on the 60th floor is not a good idea. It would not be a good idea. It would be better to be inside, downstairs, in a hallway. But just getting through the storm is not the hard part. Now that we build strong buildings, what to do after the storm is the difficult problem.
That's right. And I'm not proud of saying this, but when Hurricane Irma came, I ended up staying in my condominium and not realizing they were going to turn off the power. There was not going to be AC. It was going to be hot. Resident, you're on the 30-something floor to go down all of those stairs, all of these issues that you don't per se think through, end up really affecting you and your family. So absolutely. Now, David, Brian was mentioning some of the things when it comes to condo and sustaining. And do you see the engineering department, engineering field changing at all from what they saw in Acapulco, or are they prepared and this was just something that was very unfortunate? What are your thoughts on that?
Whereas I see what happened in Acapulco, and again, what I personally witnessed in Portugal, where they're extremes, and then they have large decisions to make, large movements to make. Since Hurricane Andrew, we had a huge change after that. I think Andrew was kind of our Otis in regards to codes. And so now, yeah, we're really more incrementally advancing the codes as to what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a relief because when Brian showed the photo of that condominium missing all of the windows, like, is that something that could happen here, or do you think that that was just not built to
It's
withstand?
not as likely. We don't use really a similar type of system. There the cladding they use a lot more what's called curtain wall construction, where they literally hang the exterior of the building, and those connections just were not designed to withstand the stress that was going to be put on them by the wind. Whereas here in Florida, we can argue the judgment of this, but half of our buildings are 40 and 50 stories tall, and we stucco them. Um, we don't see that in a lot of other places, but the one thing it does do is it does withstand a lot of wind pressure.
Yeah, it makes me think we also in Old Brickell, we do have a lot of condominiums that are 40 years and over. Is there a concern for those buildings when it comes to Hurricane 5, or is the code again just already solidified that they should be okay?
During back in that time, there might be some concerns that these are you can go in and do retrofits and reinforce and harden the buildings. Um, this is a little beyond the scope of this, but there was an incident in New York with a brand new building many years back where there was an error discovered in the structural design, and they unfortunately at the time quietly, and now it's very widely known, it would not have withstood hurricanes that ultimately actually bore down on it. So they went in and retrofitted the structure there. So each building unfortunately is going to be an individual decision to look at. On the other hand, again, knowing the recertification process, those are a lot of things that the structural engineers would at least bring to bear when they look or go through those certification programs.
Right. Okay. Good to know. We'll be sure to just, because we do have a lot of these older buildings in our membership. Along Brickleway Drive, there's plenty of those older buildings. So we can do our best to raise awareness and make sure that, they're doing their due diligence when it comes to that 40-year recertification process.
Yes.
Diana, so you are in disaster preparedness as Claremont Property Co. So did Hurricane Otis change the way businesses approach the industries and risk management and disaster preparedness in New Mexico? Or what are some of the things that you're seeing coming out of Acapulco or that region specifically?
Well, I think that, there's a shift in people's mind where now we have to have a shift in response to rapidly intensified storms. We have to get into an immediately action, knowing that the storm that we thought it was coming our way now is intensifying and it's changing completely, and it's going to be destructing us, right? I think that there's a growing awareness of the importance of disaster prevention and emergency response in general. I think that people, like you said, you cannot let your guard down. You have to be able to be ready to face, any catastrophe that is coming your way. Yeah.
No, absolutely. We have to be prepared. And, before we wrap up this webinar, if anybody from the audience has anything to share, any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to raise your hand and we will get to you. But if you don't, that's okay. In the meantime, I'd love to hear from each and every one of you, maybe just some wise words of wisdom as we end the webinar. If you had anything to share to the residents and the board members or property managers in Brickell, what would you say to them, Mr. Norcross?
Well, just building on what I said, and you brought up the older buildings. All apartments and all buildings are not created equal in terms of their hurricane risk. The higher you are, the closer you are to the corners, and the closer you are to the roof, the stronger the forces are on where you live. And so in a strong hurricane, we don't want to be in those places. That the buildings we build are strong, and on a lower floor and interior area is the safest place in the building. But you have to think through, if I stay and then I can't drive on the streets and I don't have communications and I don't have power, do I want to stay? The answer in most cases, I think, is you don't. But it's just incumbent on everybody to understand their situation. And also, essentially nobody has been around, unless people were in South Dade for Hurricane Andrew. Nobody's been around for a strong hurricane. People go, oh, Irma was really something. Well, that was barely, not really a hurricane, more a tropical storm. Or they say, oh, I was here for Wilma. That was a Category 1 hurricane when it hit Brickell and did all that damage. Category 2 in parts of Broward and Palm Beach County. So we don't have in modern times experience with strong hurricanes in downtown Miami. So we have to extrapolate from what weak hurricanes and the inconvenience that weak hurricanes caused, and then put multiples on that in terms of the effects. And I don't think that reality is well appreciated. It just doesn't happen enough really to make it right in front of us. But obviously anybody that went through Hurricane Andrew will never forget that event.
Yeah, absolutely. And even so nowadays, when it rains a little bit too much here in downtown Brickell, Edgewater, it just absolutely floods. So thinking about the storm surge of a hurricane is just something that, it's a bit hard to comprehend, but we can imagine that the damage would be very, very significant. And so we have to do our best to prepare. Thank you, Mr.
Right.
Norris. David, what would you have to say to those who are tuning in, who are property managers, board members, people in the condo world who are living in these high rises? How should we prepare, or what should we do?
It actually still kind of builds on that, we again have been very fortunate that we've been able to build up our codes. The newer buildings really have quite a bit of structure behind them, but it's important to remember again that the codes, again, probably the big thing from Acapulco is, the codes are what we anticipate. They're what we think that the building's going to be subjected to, and maybe the maximum, but we occasionally get that wrong. So, while we believe the buildings are very safe, it's certainly not likely that one's going to collapse, although we've seen, unfortunately, that may happen, but highly unlikely. But on the other hand, don't take unnecessary risks, and be prepared ahead of time and harden as much as you can.
Yeah, I'm sure our audience can reach out to you and your firm at any time, whether they have questions, whether it's
Yes.
40-year certification, structural integrity, reserves, all those good stuff. So we'll be
Right.
sure to follow up with an email that has all of your information on it. Is this being recorded, and can we get it later? I joined late. Yes, absolutely. It's live on YouTube right now, so you can go to our YouTube page and rewind it and start over at any time and share it with your board and building residents, anybody who's willing to listen. It was really educational. Diana, share with us and tell us what it is that you would have our audience want to know before they conclude.
Again, I think it's very important. Do not underestimate the situation. Just be ready. Have your supplies ready. Have your emergency plan in place. Prepare your property accordingly. Secure your roof. All your furniture outside in the pool area. Put it away. Trim all your landscaping. Just get ready and have your emergency plan. At the same time, if you're a property manager, you obviously have to have your emergency response general contractor in place. There's many companies out there. Claremont is here for you, and if you need us, by all means, they can reach out to me. But it's important to have your emergency response company in place, because we will act immediately for you.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. And if you want to meet Diana and have cafecito with her, they're doing an event. Can you tell us more a little bit about your event? That's okay.
Yeah, we're doing it on Monday, February 5th, 8 in the morning at Café Latin 2000 in Brickell. So, just a little cafecito before going to work.
Absolutely. You have delicious food. You'll be in good company. And so we'll be there
Thank you.
supporting. Love to have
Thank you.
all of our members join us as well. Brian and Mr. Riddle, I know you're far away, but you're always welcome to come down to this area. So we'll go ahead and conclude, but as we reflect on the lessons learned during this webinar, let's make sure that we stay committed to being learners, to having growth mindset, to doing our best to be prepared, not only for our sake, but for our family's sake and our community's sake. Listen to all emergency response instructions. Don't be unwise like I was at one point. Same for Hurricane Irma. Do not do that moving forward. Like, these hurricanes are pretty unpredictable at times, and so there's never enough to be said to just stay prepared and to make sure that you are putting all the things in place to make sure your condominium is safe. Once again, thank you all for joining our webinar. Thank you so much, Brian, David, and Diana. You guys, we learned so much from you, and we look forward to future events and collaborations with you all. So thank you again.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Abby.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you.